Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. My guest today is Katie Herzog, reporter and co-host of the popular podcast Blocked and Reported, along with some other guy that we won't name. She's also a contributor to Bari Weiss Substack, where she's written a remarkable series of reported pieces on what we might term the creep of unscientific wokeness into the medical field. And we're definitely going to discuss that today. But for those in the know, the most important thing that you need to know about Katie is her position as a linchpin in the radical anti-dog neuter resistance. Katie, welcome to High Noon.
Thanks for having me. That's a great introduction.
I really want to start out, before we get to the critical question of dog neutering, I really want to start out with this series of reports that you've written for Bari Weiss Substack, which, by the way, is completely the new New York Times, on what might flippantly be termed woke medicine. You've been writing about this subject. You started back in June with a piece called "What Happens When Doctors Can't Tell the Truth." What made you decide to start reporting on what's happening in med schools or hospitals? Like, how did you get the idea to start looking into sort of the medical field with regard to wokeness, or whatever we want to call it? I hate that word, but.
Yeah. So this story really originated with Bari. She came to me and she was just looking for a reporter to follow up on some tips that she'd received. So I believe the first tip was, Bari she'd been working on a series about what's happening in education, which I agree with you. The term wokeness is terrible, but it's also sort of the best shorthand we have to describe what's going on. And when she was reporting on education, she'd found this basically a private Zoom group of dissenters. And the same thing happened with medicine. So she got a tip that there were these doctors from all over the country, some of them who work in community health, some of them who work at the top medical institutions in the country, who were getting together in secret and discussing this and talking about tactics and what's going on in their institutions. So that's really where the series started, and we just broadened it out from there.
So that first piece back in June dealt primarily with doctors being silenced or, coerced in some way around topics of race. And we've seen race become a factor in medical decision-making in the last year, all the way up to the level of the CDC, which initially considered it among the factors for distributing vaccines, or who would have access to vaccines first. I think they ultimately dropped that guidance, but they were thinking about it. And then the state of Vermont, actually did adopt a guidance that essentially prioritized vaccines based on race, based on this kind of justification that people of color had been oppressed over time in the past, and therefore this kind of active discrimination was necessary to rectify that oppression. This isn't just a matter of a few, sort of young people in the field, is it? It seems like it actually has gotten pretty high up. I mean, another one of your pieces is on a lecture that was given at Yale Medical School, I believe, right? So this has gotten into the medical institutions.
Yeah. It's interesting. There does seem to be this generational divide where you have younger people in particular really pushing this ideology. But it's not just, a bunch of kids. This is also, people are listening to them. Leaders are listening to them. In the first piece, I wrote about a woman who, she's now she's the New York City chief medical officer for like the health department. I don't remember her exact title. And she wrote a piece for the Boston Review advocating for, her name is Michelle Morse, advocating for race-based admission. So people would be prioritized for healthcare based on their race. So this is not coming from nowhere. This is coming, from people with actual power.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's really scary about it, is the way it's been institutionally embraced, which I guess is kind of the story more generally in newsrooms and boardrooms. But the last piece that you wrote recently, instead of dealing with race, it deals with biological sex, which is in some way like even more scary, right? Because even though there are, and you mentioned, for example, delivery complication rates between Black women and white women, there are some limited instances where race is relevant medically. There are a lot more where biological sexism, kind of important with regard to actually delivering care. So I'm gonna quote you interviewing a doctor. So This hypersensitivity is undermining medical training, and many of these students are likely not even aware that their education is being informed by ideology. Take abdominal aortic aneurysms. I'm going to butcher a lot of these medical terms. Lauren says, these are 4 times as likely to occur in males than females, but this very significant difference wasn't emphasized. I had to look it up, and I don't have the time to look up the sex predominance for the hundreds of diseases I'm expected to know. I'm not even sure what I'm being taught. And unless my classmates are as skeptical as I am, they probably aren't aware either. Other conditions that present differently and at different rates in males and females include hernias, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, and asthma, among many others. Males and females have different normal ranges for kidney function, which impacts drug dosage. They have different symptoms during heart attacks. Males complain of chest pain, while women experience fatigue, dizziness, and indigestion. In other words, biological sex is a hugely important factor in knowing what ails patients and how to properly treat them. So that does not give me enormous confidence if I have a heart attack and go into the hospital.
Right. So this was actually a medical student I interviewed who's at a school in the University of California system. And what she told me in this piece over a series of a bunch of interviews is basically that her instructors, when they talk about biological sex, so not just gender, but when they talk about biological sex, their students will complain. So they have at the school, they have some sort of internal messaging system. And the last year, of course, was all mostly done online because of COVID. And so these students, while their instructors were lecturing or while they were watching these pre-recorded lectures, would give real-time feedback. And so these instructors were essentially being shamed. And she provided me with a bunch of apologies written in audio recordings of apologies of instructors just sort of like, almost bereft at having what they think was like offended these students. And it's definitely troubling. There's this conflation of sex and gender, and it is, I think, totally possible to be respectful of people's gender identities while still also acknowledging the reality and the necessity of biological sex, especially in medicine.
Yeah, it seems like medicine would be the one field where this, absolutely has to be recognized, right?
Right.
For the sake many times of people, especially if you, for example, don't immediately present as the biological sex that you were born, your doctor needs to know that until, lest he or she misdiagnose you with something that's more common in your biological sex than in the sex that you're presenting as.
Right. And one thing to note here, so medical records should indicate biological sex and as well as gender identity if that's necessary, but they should indicate biological sex, and they don't always. Sometimes biological sex is reflected as someone's chosen gender identity. So there was a case in 2019 where a trans man went to a hospital. He was complaining of stomach pain. The nurse assessed him as obese and thought he was in pain because he'd stopped taking his medication for hypertension. Didn't realize that this patient was actually female, and it turned out that he was pregnant and in labor. And it was by the time they figured out what was going on, it was too late, and the baby had died. This was written up in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the authors of this piece said that this guy he didn't know that he was pregnant, but he was just absolutely devastated to find out that he was pregnant and that he had lost this baby that he actually really wanted.
You said that was written up in the New England Journal of Medicine. That's another element of this we're seeing, and not just with regard to medical journals, but generally scientific journals. We're starting to see research be avoided on some of these issues that might, trigger some kind of backlash online or from younger medical students, right? And we're seeing retractions when something does get published that seem at least politically motivated. I know you and Jesse talk a lot about, recently on your podcast, you've been talking about scientific journals issuing those kinds of retractions. I mean, what are the long-term consequences when in the piece you're talking about, this medical student, Lauren, she's saying, well, I can go and look up that there are these ways that various either medicines or conditions affect the two biological sexes. I mean, what happens when there isn't any research or any new medical journal pieces being put out about those kinds of medical differences, and it just doesn't there will be nowhere to look it up?
Right. I mean, that's one of the ironies here, is that for decades, women have been arguing that our health concerns have been ignored because oftentimes For instance, when pharmaceutical companies are developing drugs, it's harder to test drugs on women because there's more variability because of our hormones, our hormone cycles. And so for decades, women have really argued that there needs to be more attention paid to what are essentially female health problems, just things like heart attacks. Like, I didn't know until relatively recently that females present with different symptoms in heart attacks than men do. I sort of, you think of like someone grabbing their arm, and that would be an indication of a heart attack, having that sort of pain right there. That's just not how it manifests in women or in females. And these are things that women have fought for years. And now there's this trend where people are just hypersensitive to any sort of perceived offense. And so they're avoiding actually talking about these issues. And one of the retractions that I read about was not actually a retraction, but this was a paper published in the journal PLOS ONE by a woman named Lisa Littman, who was then an associate professor at Brown. And she wrote an article on what she termed rapid onset gender dysphoria. So this is a population of typically natal females, typically adolescents and teenagers, who present all of a sudden with gender dysphoria, something that for deeply trans people, deeply dysphoric people, typically presents earlier in life. And she wrote this piece about this emerging population that most of us, I think, at this point are aware of, where you'll have a cohort of teen girls who all at the same time decide that they're transgender. Maybe that's a peer group, or maybe they spend a lot of time online. And Littman did this study, and there was such an outcry about this that Brown retracted a press release, and the journal PLOS ONE, they didn't retract the paper, but they investigated the paper and then made these minor corrections to the paper, sort of all cosmetic. And she just got a ton of heat by that. She is no longer at Brown. She lost her contract with the state agency after this conflict. And really, there was nothing wrong with her work. It was just activist pressure led to all of these consequences for her.
Yeah, I mean, that's really scary. That's what scares me when it does infiltrate sort of what we might consider the quote unquote harder sciences, right? Even and Katja Sedgwick, my friend who writes often for The Spectator, I mean, she wrote a piece, and she comes from the former Soviet Union. She immigrated here, and she wrote a piece saying, actually, in this small way, I mean, there are many ways in which even this current moment in the United States is much better than the former Soviet Union. Don't get me wrong. Sure. But she said, in this particular way, it's actually kind of worse because the Soviet Union was still very invested in having planes stay up, right? Like, they didn't have this enormous font of wealth the way the United States does, and this sort of security that wealth and prosperity and in this case, access to the miracles of modern medicine will just continue, right? Without the necessary research. So she said, yeah, you had to toe the political line in all kinds of places in life. If you were writing equations, you were sort of, in some way, you had a little oasis away from that, unless you went ahead and actually engaged in politics. You were kind of left alone to write your equations or to do medical research because they simply aren't as sort of wealthy and decadent as the United States. So they couldn't afford to have all that stuff go to crap very quickly. But I mean, is this going to undermine trust in your family doctor, in medical institutions going forward? I mean, what is this going to do to, I mean, you mentioned patients who are going in, sometimes older patients, and being berated about being asked, whether they're a man or a woman. I mean, what is this going to do to trust going forward? People actually utilizing medical care.
Yeah, I think that's a problem, and we'll see how far it spreads. I think we're just beginning to see this emerge right now. But for instance, I talked to a student at a medical school, at a top medical school on the East Coast, and she told me that her mother was an immigrant, and her mom doesn't speak very good English. And if a doctor, she already has trouble sort of absorbing information from her doctors, and if her doctor is asking her what her pronoun is, it's going to be confusing to her, and not just confusing, but kind of insulting. And this is something that some doctors are advocating for, this pronoun declaration, because there's a small minority of people who have alternate pronouns or present in some gender non-normative way. And so in an effort to be hypersensitive to this one small population, we're spreading this narrative or spreading this ideology to all populations. And, I don't know at this point how widespread this is, but for instance, at the Washington Post, in February, published a column by a young doctor or a resident who said this, who said, it's really important to ask my patients their pronouns and to tell them my pronouns, to announce my own pronouns to them. They don't like it. A lot of them, most of them don't like it and are offended by this, but it's important to do it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it's bias from where I live in New York, but I don't know if it's that unusual, because it seems like even in practice, it's pretty widespread. I mean, it's a little bit personal and embarrassing, but I went to the gynecologist for something routine, and I had to put on a gynecologist, form that I am in fact female. Like,
Yeah.
this is a little absurd given what I'm there for, right? But that's not, a huge deal. But when you're talking about kind of questioning patients about things like that, I mean, I'm anecdotally hearing, for example, that some of my friends who are parents, they're worried about their kids being questioned because they're finding that when they go into the pediatrician for wellness visits, that the pediatrician is asking their, 4 or 5-year-old kids, are you a boy or a girl?
Mm-hmm.
And, they're starting to think like, I mean, they want to access the care, but they are starting to feel nervous about taking their kids to the pediatrician. Like, that's certainly not what we want, right? We don't want people not going to get medical care because they're, either offended or just feel uncomfortable with the way that the medical system is dealing with some of these issues.
Right. And I think also last summer, after the death of George Floyd, and there were these mass protests, and then after months of having the public health establishment tell us, we need to stay home, you need to stay home for frontline workers, we need to keep these people safe, to have 180-degree messaging coming out after the death of George Floyd, where these public health people and doctors and nurses and other people in the field are saying, no, you need to go out and protest. And so I think that mixed messaging really does lead to a lack of trust. And a lot of people now are talking about this sort of crisis of trust in institutions. And I don't think these public health people, at a time when we really should be able to trust these institutions, especially because of the pandemic, I don't think they're doing anything to inspire it.
Yeah, that to me has been one of the tragedies of the pandemic. And I also pinpoint what you just said as basically the moment that I think this country lost control of the pandemic. And when, pandemic mitigation measures became fully ensconced as part of the culture war and became fully political, was that moment in the summer where you had, official medical boards, not only doctors individually, but the CDC and, people representing those institutions going on TV saying, after telling people for months that they couldn't even gather in small groups, for example, to celebrate the life of a dead loved one at a funeral or a wedding, right? They were telling you couldn't gather in even small groups. They suddenly endorsed gathering in very, very large groups because that was the correct political cause. I saw it happen in live time. People, and I'm on the right, obviously. So like a lot of my friends are on the right. And I saw it happen in live time. Even people who had not necessarily been, let's say, in some of the early protests against masks and lockdowns and all that, were suddenly, they were like, I'm not doing this anymore. If these institutions are endorsing it, they're endorsing these protests, this whole thing is political, and I no longer trust those institutions. It seems like that's only going to get worse if these institutions, like the reporting that you're doing, double down on what are essentially political issues rather than actually sticking to their lane, quote unquote, right? And actually providing unbiased medical advice and care.
Yeah, it's very bad messaging. I don't know who's giving these. Are they taking their advice from Twitter? I don't know. It's terrible messaging.
So, I mean, do you think that, I guess, obviously there will be an impact on how much people trust going forward, not only at the individual level going to the doctor, but even, I'm really afraid that if we'll have another pandemic, nobody will listen to any of the institutions, not even a little bit after that performance. I mean, it seems like this is sort of the dynamic going beyond the medical field now, but in a lot of the institutions, right? It's a similar dynamic in the newsrooms where, Bari Weiss forced out by essentially complaints from younger, there's a generational dynamic you referenced in the beginning of our conversation, where younger reporters are trying to impose this illiberal vision on people, let's say you are my age and then up. And I mean, that seems like that's also happening to some extent in corporate boardrooms. It's happening even in government agencies. The difference between the people working for the Biden administration now in these various agencies that are, whatever one thinks about Biden and what his actual positions are on some of these issues, some of his, people who are working in the agencies for the Biden administration, a lot of them worked in the Obama administration, and now they are considerably more woke. Even the same people have totally different priorities that have more to do with, quote unquote, racial justice or some of the, or redefining sex in the law, for example. You're seeing essentially a entire generation of people, as they gain more power in these institutions. What is the end point of this? I mean, do we need to sort of circumvent them and build something new? Is there any hope of, I would like to rescue Yale Medical School. It seems to me that that's pretty, as far as institutions go, that's a pretty important one to try to take back from the folks who would politicize it in this way.
Yeah, there has been this all across different industries, these attempts to sort of subvert the hierarchy. And I kind of get that. Historically, medicine has been extremely hierarchical. There's lots of power imbalances. This is happening in lots of different fields. I sort of understand the impulse there. But what's the problem to me is that despite what these, I'll just call them kids, I'll be condescending and call them kids, what these kids are trying to do, the adults are not standing up and saying, wait a second, no. And just these pieces that I've been reporting, it is incredibly difficult to get people on the record or people to come out as opposed to these policies because they are scared for their livelihoods. And if you have, so I have tons of anonymous sources, some of whom are very important people, but if they're not willing to put their names to their complaints, basically, I'm not sure how anything is going to change. And I completely understand. It's a self-protection measure. You don't want your name attached to these complaints. You don't want to be the one person who comes out and says, wait a second, things are going off the rails. But without people willing to do that, I don't see how things are going to change.
Yeah, there does seem to be sort of a crisis of people are willing to say anonymously that this is crazy, that a lot of what's happening is crazy, but how to inspire people to be, and I understand it's actually, you'd be the perfect person to ask this question, because for me, one, conservatives are kind of pre-canceled, right? Like,
Yeah.
The Twitter mob almost doesn't care as much, for example, about conservatives because we're just off in the corner. We have our own sort of institutions and networks. It's in some way the cancellation fire is strongest for people who are like you are on the liberal left, or who were in some of these liberal institutions like the New York Times, right? You yourself started out getting a lot of this kind of heat after writing. I think you were writing for a alt weekly in Seattle, right? And you wrote about a piece about detransitioners, right? People who had undergone some kind of sex transition and then decided that wasn't for them and transitioned back. So you went through, so what was that experience like in terms of the backlash you received? And then how do we get more people, to go through that experience and come out on the other side?
Yeah, so I wrote a piece in 2017 for The Stranger, Seattle's alt weekly, called The Detransitioners. And as you said, it was about people who transitioned from one gender identity or sex to the other and then transitioned back. They changed their mind, essentially. And at the time, a lot has been written about detransitioners now, and it's not that hard to find detransitioners. But at the time, this wasn't something people were really talking about. And the piece was, when I read back on it now, I'm sort of embarrassed by all of the hedging that I did, because I really went out of my way to make sure people knew that I think that trans adults should have access to healthcare, that laws banning transition or bathroom bills are bad. I still believe that, but I really hedged. Half the piece was probably sort of reassuring people that I had the correct politics on this, even though this wasn't an opinion piece, but it was thoroughly reported. It was fact checked. I had trans sensitivity readers, and then after it came out, thinking that this was going to, not thinking that this was going to change my life in any way. There was this huge outcry, and a lot of it was online, of course, but it also went offline. And so I guess the first sort of weird thing was that people started making flyers and putting them around Seattle, calling the piece transphobic and the paper transphobic. Somebody burned stacks of the paper and sent me video of it. People put stickers around Seattle calling me transphobic. It just got very bizarre very quickly. I lost a bunch of friends. I sort of became persona non grata in Seattle's queer community. And so it had this really major impact on my social life. It was a very stressful experience. Ironically, it was good for my career. It was probably the best thing I could have done for my career, because it gave me a name that I really didn't have before. I'd been a freelancer writing mostly about climate change until then. And so, there's sort of this irony that sometimes when you attempt to cancel people, it has the opposite of the intended effect. But, for me, it's 4 years later, I can say that this has been it was a good experience, and it was a terrible experience at the time, but far from the sort of acute stage of it, I can say that this changed me in some really fundamental and important ways. I became much more skeptical as a reporter, much more empathetic towards people who are blamed for things, before the evidence comes out. But not everybody is going to want to go through this experience. And not that I wanted to go through this experience, but not everybody is going to benefit from that. There's something about being in the media where you can sort of create a brand for yourself. And now with platforms like Substack and Patreon, become independently funded so that you don't have to rely on institutions who might not be willing to publish you, because staff members will complain. For me, it hasn't been all bad, but I think for a lot of people who aren't working in fields like media, who are working in fields like medicine or working in tech or any corporation or government, there's very little upside to sticking your neck out. And that's really a fundamental problem here. We need some sort of, not mass uprising, that's too dramatic, but just some sort of, there's power in numbers, right? And the more people who speak out, I think the more effective that will be at exposing this ideology as it creeps through different institutions. I also think, though, that there are all sorts of trends in human behavior and over time, and I think this is one of them. And trends end at some point, so I don't think that this is totally an existential crisis. I think that this will end. How it will end, I'm not sure. But I think that, and also we're seeing a lot of backlash now. So like the woker the left gets, the more reactionary the right gets. And that's also a problem. As you mentioned, I'm a liberal and I'm opposed to many of the laws coming out of conservative state governments. And I think that they are a direct result of this woke ideology on the left. How this ends, I don't have a crystal ball, but I hope it is peaceably and quickly.
Well, we can all hope that. I'm probably considerably more pessimistic on that score, but perhaps that's just the difference between being liberal and being conservative. I'm pessimistic about the entire state of humankind always, so it doesn't surprise me as much to see us descending into this. But as you said, there's no way for a lot of people. Like in a field like medicine, you need the institutional backing, right? And there's sort of a requirement for it in a way that there isn't necessarily in media, right? I do think gatekeepers in media have a purpose, and part of what we're seeing is as those gatekeepers throw away their institutional credibility, then you have sort of this thousand flowers bloom effect, which has many, many upsides and also has the downside that we're not working with a common palette of facts. Oftentimes we have totally opposing, not just worldviews, but worlds that are sort of reflected in these various democratically, small d democratically sort of dispersed media sources. But in a field like medicine, you don't want to let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of people
Right.
calling themselves doctors, right?
Right. Right.
I think the field is more difficult in that way. But you say that there are essentially these Zoom groups. It sounds like these Zoom groups have to start becoming real organized groups. And maybe that's one potential way forward, is these people they already seem like they're finding each other, and there are various wink wink nod nod ways to do that. Like in the Bay Area where I grew up, if you were sort of center or right of center, you would put an American flag on your car, and that became like probably something similar in Seattle. That became a symbol that was sort of plausibly deniable to let other people know that you were a different political orientation than those around you. But that people find each other in these ways. I mean, how do we maybe encourage them to formalize some of these groups so that it's not just one person speaking out, risking their credentials or risking their journal articles being retracted or whatever?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's opportunity here in academia in particular because of tenure. And especially in public institutions, academics are really very protected in terms of their ability to say what they want without getting fired for it. There are certainly attempts to get them fired, but oftentimes there's recourse. So I would like to see academics, particularly tenured academics, speaking up, because those are the people who obviously have a lot to lose, but they also have this sort of built-in protection that most of us in private industry or in the public sector don't have.
Yeah, I guess I just keep coming back to this question of how do we support people both financially and personally, right? Because it's not just the financial. The reason that so few people in academia do speak up, even though they have tenure, isn't just because they're afraid that there'll be a Twitter campaign to get them canceled. It's because the people that their colleagues, their friends, like their social network will abandon them or think that they're a terrible person or an immoral fascist or whatever it is. That I feel like that half is almost as powerful. Obviously, like the financial piece is probably the most important piece, but that second half.
It's huge. It's huge. The social pressure to conform. I mean, I think we saw this a lot last summer during the George Floyd protests, where you just had, like in my own social networks, people who I know were fundamentally apolitical and basically uninformed, getting sort of going all in on defunding the police and all cops are bastards sort of overnight. Some of which I think they probably believe in. Sometimes it's just there's this external pressure to conform to a narrative, and you don't want to be the person who doesn't, put up the black square on your Instagram. And we saw, corporations being called out by their employees or their customers for issuing statements in support of George Floyd that weren't strong enough. Right. So this is a major issue, is how do you when every sort of external social element is telling you to act a certain way, how do you be the person who does the opposite? And I think it takes certain personality types who are going to be willing to do this, and not everybody has that.
So here's maybe where we will disagree a little bit, because I guess the question I would ask is, why do you think that that sort of soft culture pressure only goes one way? And I think that would cut against your thesis a little bit about this being essentially a quick trend, whereas I see it more as the result of institutional power, the left, the cultural left specifically, like that creates this thing that we can't easily identify, right? That we're all like, fish in an ocean don't feel the water kind of thing. But when the academy has been very far left for a very long time, overwhelmingly. There's all the studies done on, the 0.1% or more like 1% actually, but of for example, sociology professors or whatever who identify as Republican or conservative in those institutions. So that's been, a complaint at the right going all the way back to William F. Buckley 70 years ago. But I think as the academy has become not just left, but one particular stripe of the left, where you see people even in the center left or the liberal left starting to feel that pressure from their own left. I think that has effects in kind of ripple effects in the other institutions, right? So my field is K-12 policy, And I mean, I can tell you the predecessors of this started in K-12 schools. I know you and Barry are interested in sort of tracking quote unquote wokeness, right, in the education system. But it started even 20, 30 years ago already.
Sure.
This is not something that happened just since the protests around George Floyd.
Yeah.
I guess the challenge to your flash in the pan theory would be, which, I mean, to give it its due, is totally possible. These things happen. We had moral panics before.
Right.
But I guess I see this as a more worrying thing that has, the potential to last a lot longer, because it's got so deep into all of these institutions that then create that water is wet kind of feeling for everybody. And as you say, it pushes the apolitical or the non-activist type of people. You have to conform in order to be considered a good person.
Right. Yeah. And I think education, I mean, if we look at education, schools and universities, that's probably the root of a lot of what's happening in K-12 and in public institutions right now, is that these ed schools and my mom taught in an ed school, so I know a little bit about it, really have been, they basically attract a very small sort of ideological students, and they indoctrinate them. I've interviewed students at the University of Washington education program, and they've told me, like, the schools are all about social justice. They're not talking about anything except for social justice in these schools. And if those are the people who are teaching the next generation of students, well, then the next generation of students will be indoctrinated into this ideology as well.
Yeah, I think that's really what we're seeing in surveys. And, we've mentioned already several times the idea that this is sort of a generational divide. But we're seeing in surveys that if you pick your sort of woke statement of the day, right, about sex and gender, about race, about any of these hot button topics, and you can stack the generations, right? In terms of the majority of millennials and Gen Z tend to agree with some of these statements and surveys, and the majority of Gen X and above, with, I think, people like us maybe on the cusp of it, right? The sort of older millennials.
Mm-hmm.
But you do see that, and I think that's exactly the effect of it jumping from the academy and the ed schools to, there's going to be an entire generation of American voters and professionals, right, in all of these fields that believe these things, which is why I tend to think that it's not going to stop. It's going to get worse. And then even if we do succeed, for example, in pushing some of these ideas out of the education system, however that battle is sort of waged and won, we still will have to contend with this huge demographic bulge of people who grew up seeing these ideas basically unimpeachable.
Right. I think it really also, it kind of comes down to where you live, and this isn't, it's not a state by state thing, but I think even more granular to sort of a district by district level, because the education that you're getting in, a small town Texas is probably not going to be the same education that you're getting in Seattle, Washington. And we can see this just with districts and states pushing back on CRT in education. So I think that's also sort of this interesting dynamic coming out of this, is we already live in this incredibly divided country where everything feels like it's red or blue. It's like team sports. And so, if you're in a school district in San Francisco, you're probably learning that, or you're maybe learning that there are 17 genders and that race is the most important thing about you. And if you're in some district in Texas, you're learning sort of the opposite. So we're also going to be raising students to, like, all of our cultural issues are also going to be filtering down into the next generation, and in terms of what sort of education people are receiving in their schools. And it also depends on what's going on in the federal government. I'm a Biden voter. I was happy to vote for anybody to get Donald Trump out of office. But I was also concerned about Biden, even though he was the least woke candidate of the Democrats, of him incorporating some of these ideas into the federal government. And it is happening. We can see it happening. We can see it happening in his policies. But we don't know who's going to be the president next time. Is the president going to be, maybe it'll be Donald Trump, and we'll see the opposite things coming out of the federal government.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to ask you maybe how you feel about supporting Biden, not in a like sort of partisan way, but because I followed this kind of discourse during the election, for example, from folks like Andrew Sullivan, who clearly, and you, who clearly see the danger of one particular part of the left taking over, but are also concerned or equally concerned or more concerned about that on the right. And I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. I even though I'm a lifelong basically Republican, decided not to vote for him, didn't like him, and just wrote in. I just wrote in a dead guy. I mean, I didn't vote that year basically, and then wrote a piece about why I did vote for Donald Trump in 2020, and a lot of it was exactly the institutional backing for the woke left versus for Donald Trump. Like, whatever you think about the sort of to the extent that a crazy right wing exists, I just don't see them having the kind of institutional power, and therefore they don't worry me as much. Like the some of the more extreme parts of the right, even in the Donald Trump administration, and even Donald Trump himself as president, was opposed by everybody who worked in his own agencies, was opposed. Of course, the media was fanatically and counterproductively opposed to Donald Trump, right? To the extent that they blew all their credibility on it.
Sorry, Moose just woke up. Let me let him out. Give me a second. Unless you want to see him.
No, I do want to see him.
Moose, come here. Come here. Come here. Come say hi. Come say hi. Come here.
Moose, for listeners, Moose is Katie's a Twitter famous golden doodle, right?
Yes. This is Moose. Moose's testicles were written about in the Washington Post today, so he's very proud.
Yes, as I mentioned at the top in the bio, Katie has not neutered her dog, and this has she's written about that decision very interestingly. I know it's a strange recommendation, but I highly recommend the piece that Katie wrote about her decision not to take her dog to the snip snip.
How could you take these balls away? I mean, just look at this precious guy.
Aw.
Yeah.
No, but I guess that was the rationale, and I'm wondering how you feel about the Biden administration thus far. Because it seems to me that even though Biden himself has made relatively few nods in the sort of rhetorical level, the people actually running all of the agencies, I mean, you had a proposed rule that is now delayed because there were so many comments submitted in opposition, but a proposed rule to give out grants on the basis of schools implementing critical race theory. We've seen Title VI and Title IX, the definition of sex rewritten by sort of executive fiat, which is these dear colleague letters. I mean, we're seeing a lot of the Biden administration output has been, I think, more on the subjects of racial discrimination and sort of the gender wars.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was conflicted about voting for Biden, not so conflicted that I didn't do it. But to me, this issue is very important. Obviously it's important. I write about it all the time. I think about it all the time, but it's not the only issue. I'm also concerned with not just wokeness in medicine in our healthcare system. I'm more concerned about the fact that so many millions of Americans don't have access to healthcare. Not that Biden has fixed that. And so for me, my politics are more than just these cultural issues. And in fact, I wish that these cultural issues were totally separate from the government. Obviously, that's never going to happen. But it bothers me to see these adopted by these cultural war issues to become fodder for basically campaigns. But so things like infrastructure, and not Trump's pretend infrastructure week where everything goes to shit, but the actual infrastructure bill, trying to get people insured, working on housing and things like this. There's just bigger issues than this one thing. Do I think that Biden will usher in some woke apocalypse? No, not entirely. I mean, it's sort of the darker moments of the night. Maybe I have those thoughts every once in a while, but just I try to look at politics as just sort of bigger picture. And for me, I mean, the reason that I'm a liberal is because I think that the government has an obligation and a responsibility to care for our most downtrodden and our poorest citizens. And I just see Democrats doing, or at least trying to do, a better job of that. I'm not so dogmatic that I think that that Republican policies couldn't, in theory, do just as well. But until they prove themselves just as effective, or I don't know, sort of harnessing the public sector or whatever to cure things like poverty, if you guys can figure it out, I will become a Republican. But I just don't see that happening. And so to me, it just came down to what is more important, policies on climate change, policies on healthcare, or these cultural issues. And for me, these other things just end up being more important.
It's interesting because that makes you, I think, one of the very rare band of voters who are actually prioritizing what might be called traditional political issues or economic issues over the culture war, because it seems like the polarization is happening in the opposite direction, where you have people going with their vote on the cultural side of things, even if they disagree with economics. And I think it'll be really interesting to see if we get a non-woke Bernie style candidate.
Sure.
Because
could be Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and you mentioned it a second ago. So I think you're right about one thing and wrong about one thing. So I think it's true that that progressives, liberals do have this sort of cultural power right now, in a way that, for instance, after 9/11, we didn't have, much more conservative. There was also deep pressure to conform after 9/11 and to jump on this sort of jingoistic, nationalistic bandwagon. But Republicans do have a lot of power in a lot of places. I mean, courts in many places are dominated by Republicans. If you want to get an abortion in Georgia or Texas, I don't know how you feel about that particular issue. It's something that's not top of my list of important things, but I do believe in a woman's right to have an abortion. That's going to be a lot harder to do in some of these states. So again, I think it really comes down to where you live. And we oftentimes have the perception that I think the culture is, for sure, like American culture right now, I think, dominated by progressive values. Hollywood, the media, academia, publishing, but Republicans still do. I mean, the Supreme Court is dominated by conservatives. So I don't think it's quite true to say that liberals have taken over, that we have all the power, that we have taken over all of these institutions, because the ones that are the most important, which I think are governments, are oftentimes still dominated by conservatives.
So I'll agree with you to the extent that I think Republicans still have traded power back and forth with Democrats or even the progressives in terms of pure politics. I guess that's been the critique from a lot of people on the right, including me, which was basically that we put all of our chips in the political, in sort of raw political power, winning elections and then implementing, tax cuts or, sort of Republican economic goals. And we forgot that actually what really moves the culture over time is academia, is Hollywood, is, all of these cultural institutions. And so that's been a critique on the right from me, among other folks, but that in fact, that was a huge mistake, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, put all of our chips in the purely political means that we're always losing continually on these important cultural issues, but we're losing slowly and over time in a way that, a frog's boiled in a pot.
I guess the question is just what has more impact on people's daily lives. And again, I think it really comes down to where you live. I mean, I live in a blue state, you live in a blue state. Our experiences during pandemic are going to be very different than the experience of somebody living in Florida. That's true.
We do still have federalism, and there's still certainly Republicans do have historic actually dominance in state legislatures. And that's been the case for the last decade or so. Actually, it started really with the waves of 2010. But again, because Republicans, I think, had lost a lot on the national level, so they invested a lot politically in state legislatures. I think you might see that change as Democrats figure out that actually that could be a battleground too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Republicans are in many ways better at politics than liberals are. We're better at culture. You're better at politics.
That might be true. It's something that I think is really funny, just observationally. Every liberal or progressive even is just convinced the Democratic Party is really, really bad at politics, and every conservative is convinced the Republican Party is really, really bad at politics. I think that probably the truth is they're both really bad at politics.
Yeah. I also think that this breakdown, it's a handy shorthand to talk about conservative and liberal, but I also think things are really changing, and that's not really, the metric doesn't really work as much. I mean, I see things as sort of more like, are you an authoritarian? Or are you a libertarian? And sort of the way that people are thinking about the role of government and the role of culture right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one axis. I also think what we're seeing is the biggest group of undecided voters, which is why I said as a conservative, I fear the anti-woke Bernie, right?
Yeah.
Because I actually think that would be a really potent and successful political force in America, meaning universal health care, raising the minimum wage, which are things I disagree with on an economic basis, but plus, a sort of center-right cultural sensibility and a pushback against, like, if the Democratic Party were to run somebody like that, I feel like that would be very difficult for Republicans to win. Like, I think there's a huge opportunity. And the flip side, I think if Republicans ran somebody who was more flexible on economic issues and, for example, added universal health care to these are things I disagree with as a policy matter, but I'm just trying to think strategically, that candidate would be really, really difficult to stop.
Yeah. I mean, Bernie himself wasn't particularly woke. His staffers certainly were, but he himself, and Bernie, I mean, I think besides the fact that Bernie's, old and he's from Vermont, he hasn't gotten much done in his political career. The stink of socialists, I think, I think liberals really overestimate how well that term goes over in most of America.
Yeah, for sure. And Bernie is himself an interesting case in this, because in 2016, he was notably not as woke. And then when he ran again in 2020, seemed to have reversed his positions, for example, on immigration over time. He paid a lot more lip service. You could tell it's still not what motivates his little Marxist heart, right? Obviously, his bread and butter are still class and economic issues, but he paid a lot more lip service to it. And I think that's indicative of where the Democratic Party is going. But we could argue about how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are failing everyone for a very long time.
I think we can agree on that. They're both terrible.
Yeah, there's the common ground. But Katie, thank you so much for coming on High Noon. You can follow Katie's work by subscribing to her podcast and the Patreon for it. Patreon, I never know. As well as, I hope you'll be writing more pieces for Bari Weiss's Substack, and more reports. Her reported pieces on the medical industry and medical field have been really, really eye-opening. I highly recommend those, as well as her pieces on dog neutering. Katie, thank you so much for coming on High Noon with Moose as well. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.